Our first presenter will be Chantal Wilson Mahaffey. Chantal Wilson is the Manager, Collections and Registration at the Image Center. Working with the IMC collection since 2010, Wilson focuses on developing internal policies, assessing appraisals, managing collections, processing acquisitions, and advising on preservation issues. Most recently, she's been participating in a practical application of mass digitization and AI cataloging principles within a museum context. Wilson holds a Bachelor of Arts honors in art history from the University of Saskatchewan and a Master's of Arts in photographic preservation and collections management from Toronto Metropolitan University. As an accredited member of the International Society of Appraisers, Wilson has expertise in photography, photographic materials, photographically illustrated books, and works on paper. The paper that Chantal Wilson Mahaffey will be presenting is titled Rudolph P. Bratty Collection ARKIV 360. Please join me in welcoming Chantal Wilson Mahaffey.
All right, good morning, everybody. Thanks, Natalie, thanks, Ted. I'm gonna get started here. So I'm gonna present this from a little bit of a different context than what we've been hearing already, which is a case study context. And even though, I think this was mentioned yesterday, even though the Image Center sits within the broader context of Toronto Metropolitan University, this is, we're kind of couched in the small to mid-size museum group. So this case study is presented just with that knowledge. So I just wanted to start that off by saying that. So I'm gonna split this presentation into two kind of parts. The first is the digitization part, and the second is the cataloging part. And we'll kind of talk about those two things separately for now. And we'll come together at the end with kind of some conclusions about these things. So I'll tell you a little bit about the collection that we chose for this experiment. This is the very first collection experiment we've used with automated technology, AI, any sort of automated tools. Obviously, as collection specialists, we use tools to automate our workflow frequently, but this was the first time that we have used generative data in our experimentation. So the Rudolph P. Bratty Family Collection, it was promised to us in 2017 by real estate entrepreneur Chris Bratty. This collection represents diverse aspects of Canadian life and the history in the 20th century, and is it's from the New York Times picture morgue originally. So you can read a little bit about the subjects that are included in this collection, but the thing to kind of understand about why we chose this was the complex subject matter and the relative stability of the objects. We wanted to kind of look at a collection that had a lot of context, a lot of information that might have been published or not published. We wanted a variety of objects, but we wanted them to be fairly planar, stable for handling by multiple people, and also relatively stable in terms of like collections management preservation. So the works in this collection are primarily gelatin silver prints, and most of those gelatin silver prints are also wire photos. And then we have some stabilization prints, which for those of you that don't know, our wire photos are quickly processed gelatin silver prints with active chemistry that hasn't been rinsed off or fixed. So there's a varying level of image quality and readability in these images. So we knew that we wanted to digitize them to preserve the objects because there is some risk of deterioration, but also we wanted to kind of use this opportunity to apply some lessons that we've learned from our other collections at the Image Center. So you might have heard about the Black Star collection. We've been spending the last 20 years providing access, learning about it, preserving it, taking care of it. And so we approached this project with a very basic research question, which is, how does automation and AI increase efficiencies in cataloging and digitization? What will this project actually bring us? What will it offer us? What will we learn? So things that we've learned from Black Star, obviously, is that cataloging time is long and complicated, and it didn't always meet the expectations of researchers, right? So we kept getting questions like, how do I search for this? And how do I search for this when we have a very basic kind of cataloging framework for that collection? Which came primarily from how it was organized in the archive originally. If you're using digital traditional imaging techniques, the digitization was slow and time was not always available. So therefore, the majority of that collection is not digitally available. As I mentioned, we don't have accompanying indexes or published records, so we've had to rebuild the kind of context around the Black Star collection about where it was published, how it was used, how artists interacted with the agency. And so we had really hoped that we could build out that context with a collection that had much more published information on the versos of the photographs. And we learned very quickly that the digitization for the sake of reference does not help our collection access and our preservation efforts. It really has just, for us, created duplicate workflow and redigitizing the same object multiple times over. So these are kind of the approaches that we went into with this process. So a few of you, many of you, went to visit the Archive 360 studio yesterday with Ed Bertinsky, and you heard about their efforts in providing this kind of service to heritage institutions, private clients, and so on. We partnered with Ed Bertinsky and Archive 360 in 2023 to write a grant to support a project like this, and we were awarded that grant in 2023. And this kind of collaboration is what spurred this project and made it possible, just from not only from a funding perspective, but from a timeline perspective as well. So for those of you who haven't been to see the machine, I will kind of try and recap the context for you. So this is kind of an overview, bird's eye view of the machine. The machine has 4 easels that are roughly, I want to say 11 by 17 inches, and they have an easel kind of cover on top of them. I'll show you another photo in a second. That opens and closes and can kind of stay up and down as people are feeding objects onto the easel. So somebody is standing at the work table feeding one easel with objects, and then somebody's usually on the other side of the work table taking them off. And then there's somebody at the tethered computer kind of watching the captures. The verso and the recto are captured simultaneously, kind of at the 4th repetition where the camera viewfinder looks down. But there is a camera below and above, and it's lit to kind of be white balanced and create a planar document, like a planar document. So that is kind of how the mechanics work of it. But we spent a lot of time in the early testing stages working with the team to get to the 4-star FADGI kind of quality of objects. We mentioned FADGI yesterday, but if you are not familiar with it, I encourage you to look it up because it is the current North American leading standard for the preservation of film and photography. This kind of standard is what the Image Center works towards in our preservation model. And we were able to reach, for the majority of the collection, that 4-star FADGI level standard, which for reference is roughly 600 PPI size as for the object, just for some base knowledge about that. So this kind of rapid rate, the table moves at a very high rate, and the team there can digitize roughly between 400 and 800 objects a day if there are no other contextual elements that the institution applies to that. So you might have heard them mention that they work very closely with all of their clients for their all individual needs. So for us, the table was moving far too fast because the lifting and the closing of the object, like the handling of the object requires 2 hands, so you can't be holding an object and lifting the easel at the same time. So you have to lift the easel and move it with 2 hands onto the thing. So that slows it down by a few seconds per repetition. All of our objects are in transparent sleeves that are also marked to be labeled so that they can be married back with the object. So the person loading the machine has to unsleeve the object, put it onto the machine, it goes around, it gets taken off the machine, it gets put back into the sleeve. So that kind of caretaking management part of it really does, all those seconds add up over time. So what that means is that our output for roughly 21,000 assets was 40 business days. So that's still incredible. From our perspective, because we have a very low digitization rate for the context of the size of the collection. And we requested a TIFF file and a RAW file from Archive 360. They can kind of output any type of number of files that you require. So in addition to the two files, so the two files that were output by the camera on the table, so here's, just to clarify, here's a real in-life photograph of the table. And just to give you a rough estimate of size, it's probably around 60 inches in diameter. Just to give you an idea of the footprint, it's obviously also surrounded by light blocking curtains at the ceiling and at the sides and at the bottom of the machine. And the lights can kind of be maneuvered around the machine as you need for the different objects and for the different balancing of color and light. In addition to that, different cameras are used for different resolutions, and they've kind of made adjustments inside of the camera like settings to account for the fact that it's sitting in a position that it wouldn't normally be sitting in if it was being used as a traditional camera. So there's some interesting manufacturing elements that they've kind of adjusted here to kind of make this possible. So yeah, so I'll stop there for that but if there's other questions about how that system works, feel free to ask me at the end. So in addition to the two files that we asked them for, we then created a minimum of 4 files total. So obviously that's the recto verso, front and back, in a TIFF and a JPEG format. And that's because we have a JPEG for access via our database, and then we have a TIFF for a preservation file, and then we keep the raw file in case we have to go back and make adjustments for other purposes. So that's why the FADGI standard is so good for this reason, is because we can kind of go back and edit the file and make a derivative for whatever we need, and we can incorporate that into a future digital asset management program. For our purposes, we proofed the asset and rotated it. Archive 360 can do auto-rotating. So they cropped and balanced it for us, and then we proofed it and rotated it and renamed it to match our file naming standards. So because we don't have a digital asset management system, we're still building our digital infrastructure at the Image Center. We were doing this all manually or with automated Python tools. So this is quite an arduous process. In terms of it's not a complicated workflow, but it is it's very time onerous. The asset is then uploaded to our server, and then it's linked to our internal database, which is also published externally. So as I noted there, it's about just over 2,800 hours or 394 business days. That's just for the post of the files. So that's just the management of the digital assets after they've been captured. So in comparison to the capture time, that's a big difference. So that's one of our conclusions is, we need to figure out how to automate that process to make it more relational to the capture time. So obviously, in comparison to traditional digitization methods, this increases our capacity immeasurably. There are a lot of human intervention points before and after. So obviously, from a collections management standpoint, you want to make sure your collection is inventoried and you're doing the correct risk assessment to make sure that they can kind of go through all of these motions. In our case, we had a staff member that oversaw the transport and the handling of the objects on site because of our insurance requirements, but sometimes the objects can't leave the facility that the digitization needs to happen in. So if you are planning a project like this, you just might want to take that into consideration, and you need to do the appropriate risk assessment to make sure that these objects can withstand this kind of handling and digitization effort. The specifications and the requirements for the institutions might not match the capabilities of the operators. And that's not it's not the specific person, it's more that as you can see, the machine, I'm just going to go back to this image, the machine is set up for a static capture. So the lens is not going up and down, it's not being adjusted for size. That easel is obviously a single size. So if you have a variety of sizes of objects, sometimes you may need to adjust your expectations for specifications or organize the output by the size of the object. So for example, if you had a bunch of objects, a bunch of press photographs, and there was some 5x7s and some 8x10s and some 11x14s, you would have to kind of organize that by object to get the optimum output, because it's not really possible for the adjustments to be made on the fly. They kind of set it up for the day and they have to kind of run it at that speed. So that's how kind of the time change is always impacted. So that estimate that I gave for file processing, that's still ongoing here at the IMC. We're ahead of schedule, hoping to be done by the end of April for that. But we know that this is too high to continue working on projects like this. And for those of you who are involved in fundraising efforts for your institutions, grants like this are perfect for formulating new arguments for more funding for the next thing that you need to do. So I'm going to switch gears from that to the AI protocols that were part of this experiment. So as you might have heard from yesterday, ARKIV 360 is developing their own kind of AI protocol system that is built into their own internal database. So they're kind of building their own language model tool and their own internal database that they hope to share in the future with other institutions. For our purposes, the New York Times collection, we don't own any of the copyright. That all remains with the New York Times or the original photographers. So we're unable to kind of hand that process over to an external party. It has to funnel through the TMU or the Image Center kind of protocols, and it does need to be linked to our internal database. So we had them export this data and provide it to us, A, so that we could do an analysis of it, and B, so that we could funnel what we needed into our own database. For us, having tools and databases upon databases is not really functional for our team because we have a small team, and we're linked very, I wouldn't say separately from the internal computer system IT department here, but it's a very tangential relationship. We kind of have to support ourselves in those efforts. So we kind of try to limit the amount of additional technology we're bringing into the institution that we have to manage long term. So this is a brief overview of the the AI tools that were implemented and the protocol that was implemented on these digitized assets. So they include large language open source models, optical character recognition technology, trainable labeling software, reasoning models, and translation applications. So because this was a Canadian Heritage grant-funded project, we had to provide the output in both French and English, and we've kind of already heard some of the problems with that issue, not only from like a data set perspective, but in our case, it literally is a language problem with our internal staff, right? Like we don't have a French first cataloger. We need to figure out how that can kind of be integrated into our future plans. So we were dealing with kind of getting French information back and figuring out how do we verify this in a way that's fair, that matches the language of the political climate and also of our own community, because there's obvious differences between some of those things. So the output, I'm going to show you just a quick example. You're not meant to like see the detail here, but this is what output looks like from those kinds of language models that we then have to investigate. So we get it all as Excel data, and we have to kind of weed through it and use our own applications to import it into the database. So I'm going to show you a few examples. One of a good famous example of a really well-known photograph that's not even by a New York Times photographer, but by obviously from a NASA astronaut. And I'm going to separate this between the automated generated data and the OCR data. So the optical character recognition, I'm going to show you that separately. We're going to just focus right now on the tags. So I'm just going to flip back one slide. So what ARKIV 360 exported things to us in 4 kind of groups. So they did keywords, transcript, which is inscriptions, an auto-generated description, and then a secondary set of tags that used all 3 of those keywords, transcript and description, to then output another set of information. So it was kind of like teaching itself as it was going through the protocol. So in this kind of, and I've highlighted and read the things that maybe are problematic or that we want to kind of analyze and think about. So these are the tags that came back from this object. So as you can see, it's kind of reading shapes, it's reading objects, it's telling us there's flash photography involved in this, maybe some darkness, moon graphics, multimedia software, illustrations, because somebody's been handwriting on it, travel, spaceship, natural landscape. The description, as we've heard from other presenters, is pretty good. It seems like the tools out there, the generative descriptions, are pretty accurate. We've found that throughout this collection, the descriptions are correct. They just need a little bit of tweaking to basically remove extraneous data that we don't need. So sometimes we find a lot of times that in the description there's the word photograph repeatedly, and people already know they're looking at a photograph. So we have kind of tried to remove some of that information, which we see in the keywords below. So this is another example, one that includes a person. We have found in general that if the name is not on the verso, the image recognition is not great unless it is a celebrity, which kind of goes towards the point that was mentioned yesterday, which the image recognition is only going to be good as the data set that it has access to. So here we have the AI tool generating an emotion for us, which is happy, which is kind of interesting. And again, this idea that it thinks that this is a stock photograph, which is not incorrect, it's just where did they get that information from? And then we get into issues like problematic language, which is something we're used to with the Black Star collection. So we have different racial, ability, and gender issues with some of the words that come up with the AI, so we are vetting those for that information. And then in addition to keywords, we're getting some language issues back. So sometimes we get keywords in other languages, and we're not exactly sure why. So I just wanted to kind of show another example in relationship to a catalog record that, like a human cataloger. I don't know why I put quotations around human, but a human cataloger that has also cataloged, so that you can kind of see the difference between somebody that's cataloged it in person and an AI generative example. So let me just flip to this other option here. Come on. Okay. So this is, so we have captioned these because this actual object was part of our 2016 exhibition and publication, The Far Away Nearby. So we had catalogers actually catalog this data. So you can kind of read more to get the full title at the top. You see the collection, you see the photographer, you see the other related. So if there was a printer or a newspaper here, we would list those people. We have the date of the event. We have the medium. We have the title translated into French. And then we have the inscription in English and French. So right now, because the keywords are not indexed yet, and because there seems to be multiple variations of the keywords in terms of like case and context, and they're kind of not brought together in a way that we can export it into our database. I know that the Archive 360 team is doing that in their back end, but that technology doesn't get exported to us. We just get the raw kind of keyword data. So we're kind of doing this in stages where the keywords are not published yet, but they remain searchable in our database. So they're in the record and they're being searched on, but because they're not indexed, it's not really usable if we publish them on our online record. So just to show you, I'm just showing you this, the next slide makes sense. So just give me 1 second here to go back. So just to give you some context. So this is the verso of that image, and this is the AI-generated OCR on the top and the cataloger's inscription on the bottom. So in this case, this verso includes a full picture story role list. So the photographer is stamping on every photo in the photo story that they published what each photograph is. And these captions are only, this caption here that's marked with red is the only caption that actually applies to the photograph. So while this verso information is being completely generated, the cataloger here is actually noted. Like, I'm not transcribing all of this because it's not related. Because they've recognized that some of that information is just the same on each story. And they've obviously marked where things are circled. It's been segmented by the type, the stamp, the ink, so on and so forth. None of that is kind of captured in this. However, it's pretty close. Like it's pretty good. It's very readable. This technology doesn't seem to be having too many problems with reading all the various types of notations, whether it's stamped, written, pressed on with a caption. This is a relatively simple verso from this collection. Most of our collection has folded captions or like other things attached to this that could maybe throw a machine off. But we're quite impressed with the actual export of the optical character recognition. I'm just going to give you another example of this. So in this kind of situation, we have a caption that's folded onto the back that when you look at the front, you can kind of see the caption that it was meant to be published with. And you see the other tags and the description. So again, here we see in the description that they're saying it's in a 1952 photograph, right? We already know it's a photograph. And just to point out some of the things I mentioned with the case study, the Governor Massey is not capitalized. We have the word native here, which is problematic, even though it's used in the context of the caption. There's different issues around that word. NYT is abbreviated in several different forms. So we have kind of we have to kind of collect this information and index it properly. And again, we have the inscription on the verso and the human cataloging on the bottom. So in this case, the cataloger inscribed it as a verso inscription because it was folded backwards. And the AI didn't catalog it as an inscription at all. So the credit on the credit on the recto is in blue on the bottom, which is missing in this case, right? So here we see like errors on both ends and kind of see the comparison between like how do you make decisions, how do you account for those kinds of things in this type of technology. So what are we doing with this information? So right now, our stage is that we are planning our workflow to kind of sort through this. We are going through each record, and we're verifying the key fields that are currently still missing from our cataloging process. This includes still the photographer and the date, because as you've noticed, those 4 exported informations don't include that unless it's on the actual object. So we have to go through and kind of verify that information. We are actually editing the generative descriptive information to remove some problematic language, correct for errors, avoid duplication, and kind of match it to our cataloging standards in-house. We're editing the OCR transcriptions to match our industry standards, so we're moving things back so that they're segmented by ink, stamps, so that a cataloger can read it more clearly. And then we're finalizing our collection finding aid to include a summary of the AI interventions, because we feel like it's really important to show that we want to be transparent about the technologies that have been used to provide access to this collection, and both what that means for increased access and also limitations for this information. Future goals that I really hope we can take on is that this AI information can track duplications and variations of the same image in our collection. That we can verify the published material in the New York Times Time Machine, which is the full online digitized archive of the newspaper. So if you go and look at any of, most, if not all, of our photographs have a published date with a stamp every time the image was published in the newspaper. And we have kind of timed out and estimated a time if we wanted to actually go through and link it to every published instance in the archive. Spoiler alert, it's not functional to use labor for that. So we hope that can be something that we can connect. We hope to identify appropriate controlled vocabularies to index and analyze keywords tagged by Archive 360. So using those keywords and doing kind of what was explained yesterday, linking them to controlled vocabulary so we can kind of teach the model how to be more predictive with standardized language that's going to evolve and consider the ethical and cultural heritage considerations that we're all used to considering when we're cataloging manually. And then, of course, supporting search functions more broadly. Are keywords really the best way to do this in the future in general? I think there's some thought out there that is not the case. So is this really where we want to focus our attention? So if I go back to our original research question, can this automation increase our efficiencies? Well, of course, right? It's like turning on the gas and lighting it up and letting it kind of go wild. So it's really about streamlining our access to this extensive tool and figuring out what we're really going to focus on. We know that cataloging time is long and complicated, and now we have some expedient information, but we have new information to verify. So we have all of this new context, all of this new information. We have to sort through it. We have to verify it and make sure it's publishable so that we can make it accessible. We have the digital files now, but in our planning phase, the processing time was only estimated to be about 8.5 months, and we've far exceeded that. So that has definitely led us to some conclusions about how we need to invest in our digital platforms and our digital technology to support these projects. We don't have the right indexes and the right research tools, so how do we utilize those and identify and prioritize how we link that so that we can provide as much access as possible and as much additional research possibilities? And that we seem to have solved the digitization for the sake of reference until the specifications change again. Obviously, FADGI gets updated on a regular basis, and that's why we push to get the highest level of FADGI so that we can maintain these as preservation files for as long as possible. We are really trying to preserve and stabilize the original object so that we don't have to go back and digitize so many times. The scale and size of our collection is too kind of gigantic to continue to go back and revisit this over and over again. So in addition to new information, we have a lot of extra questions that come along with these kinds of experiments. And I'm sure some of these will come up in this session this afternoon, but I've just kind of put these up here to leave them with you. I won't read them all out, but basically the moral of it is how do we work with standardized vocabulary? How do we integrate standardized vocabulary and museum standards into automated tools is a big question that I have coming out of this. How do we deal with human intervention and automated tools? Does this really speed up the process? I've already mentioned linking the online database with the New York Times printed newspapers. A big question that we have here is related to copyright. How do we deal with copyright in this kind of situation? It's a big, giant elephant in the room that nobody really wants to talk about because none of us really know how to advise on it because there's not a lot of case law giving us a lot of information. And obviously the utilization of private sector models like Archive 360, could they restrict long-term access and technology for public institutions? Should we be figuring out a way to be more collaborative and developing these things in-house? So yeah, and then some of the other things that we have talked about in the collections team as part of our reparative collection process is how do we deal with AI biases? In addition to human biases. So now we're doubling up on our perspectives and trying to figure out what that means for us and how we approach cataloging. So that's what we have figured out so far. That's where we stand. I think we have more questions than answers, but I think that's okay. This couldn't have happened without the grant from the Canadian Heritage Department, the Rudolph P. Bratty family, Ed and his team at Archive 360, and I am supported by a group of people that are very dedicated collection specialists, both past and present. So I just want to say thank you to everybody that's contributed to this project.
This was a really fantastic, wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. We've got a few minutes for questions, so we'll open up for questions from the room, if there are any. All right, have we got a runner or am I the runner? I can be the runner.
Would this technique work with a family archivist?
You mean the digitization portion?
Yes.
I think so. I mean, anything that, it depends on the type of materials, but it could very well work for something like that. I think at this point, I don't know of any private collections that have been digitized with Archive 360 specifically, but the technology is there to support multiple types of, I would say, flat photographs. So works on paper. It's not, there's going to be some limitations with albums that are not fully detached, that you can't take things apart with. But yes, it could definitely be applied.
So I also noticed that that FADGI system is an American sort of cataloging thing.
FADGI is it's a North American standard, and in Europe, the equivalent is Metamorphose. So those two groups kind of work together to develop those standards.
So is it almost like the ICC for scanners and
Yeah,
photograph?
similar in terms of standards. They're just a specific type of standard. Many digitization standards don't often address things by medium. They it's like a broad standard, and in what FADGI and Metamorphose do is they actually segment it by medium to apply the type of recommendations based on the medium. So if you go to FADGI's website, you can look up photography and film, you can look up painting, you can look up audio, you can look up all different types of mediums. So I think that's where it is. It's actual cultural specialists coming in and saying, like, this is the best we can get to right now, and how do we stabilize it moving forward?
All right, other questions? Great, in the back.
At the end of your talk, you made a passing reference to, I guess, the possibility of keywording essentially becoming obsolete, and I wonder what the alternative is.
I don't know. Yeah, I wish I had an answer to that. I think we've tried unsuccessfully to keyword collections in the past. And because of the human bias and the lack of comprehensiveness of keywording, we feel like we're leaving things out sometimes. So it kind of feels like, is there a way to do this better? Or is it just another tool in the workflow? Is kind of, I guess, where I was headed. Because we found situations where we keyworded and we've left out situations, or we learned something and it has to go back. Keywording is kind of one of those things that has to always be continuously added to. So is it sustainable?
So is this this is a conclusion you've come to in your work, or is this like part of a larger conversation in
I think
cataloging?
it's a part of a larger conversation in this community in general. A lot of digital asset management systems will probably start to build in auto-generative image recognition that kind of does all of that for you and doesn't require human intervention. And I know catalogers are very against that, or general heritage institutions are against that for obvious reasons. But I think people are searching less and less by keyword, I guess is what I'm saying. We find our researchers don't search very much by keyword.
So what are they searching by?
They're searching by things that we have already indexed. So things like subject heading, they're looking for a specific photographer, they're looking for a specific medium. So we have to kind of hit all of those different things to make sure that we're giving everybody the information they're looking for. And to be quite honest, I don't know if people aren't looking by keywords because they're not there, or because they're not looking for them, they're not using them, because we haven't been able to verify our keywords with a controlled vocabulary in this instance, so we haven't published them to see if they're being utilized. So that's just a disclaimer on that side.
Great. We've got a question just right here.
Thank you. Could you speak a little bit more about the issue of problematic language? Because while there are some human or machine biases that you just want to get rid of, but don't you want to preserve the history of how these language references are made and used?
Yeah, so I think from our perspective, this language is preserved in the inscription methodology. We're not going to apply those words for modern viewers or modern access research. So we have maintained the original order and language of how the archive was organized. And then we transcribe the inscriptions so that those are searchable. And from our perspective, the keywords are additional applications with modern kind of context, not necessarily things you want to continue to encourage people to search by. So it's still searchable because it's searchable in the inscription fields. But I think from our perspective, continuing to encourage people to search by those words is perpetuating the language barrier. If that makes sense.
Thank you for your presentation, and the tour yesterday was fantastic. And what I thought there and this morning, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about copyright and data ownership. Thinking about just the difference on this slide of what the AI is generating, what you're cleaning, and then how that relates to public access, but then also language model training.
Yeah. So from Toronto Metropolitan University's perspective, what we're publishing online is a promotion of our collection catalog. So it's very much like this is what's in our collection, and we're giving you research access to it. So that kind of falls under a fair use model from our perspective in terms of using the images to create access. That gets and these are, I should mention that these are primarily staff photographers paid by the New York Times. In our other collections, the majority of the copyright sits with the original creator, and because it's a mid-century to kind of late 20th century collection, many of these people are still alive, so everything's under copyright restriction. So it's a problem just even to publicize the images online. It's a problem to give access to them. We are lucky that we have a university that is a little bit less risk averse, but we know that that comes with its own problems. It comes with people stealing images or web crawling or data being uploaded into AI tools now, where we don't have control over where that data goes. We tend to err on the side of caution with where our data is transferred and stored. The university is pretty strict about keeping it in Canada. We are in favor of keeping it in Canada for obvious reasons. But when we start using automated tools, we have less and less control of what happens, especially free open source tools. So it's definitely a question to consider for all of us to consider in our projects, because we don't know, and there's no proven case law to tell us what the law is yet.
Thanks for your talk, Chantal. That was great. I had a quick question just about keywording and using AI tools. Is there an opportunity to gain metrics or feedback about the level of confidence that the AI has on a given image that could then be used to sort of direct how staff choose what to validate and what not to validate?
I think Christopher's presentation yesterday was showing the possibilities of some of that. That is something that we're very interested in pursuing because that could help prioritize what collections we move through first, especially things where we can flag, language that we know is going to be an issue or conflicts that we know are going to be an issue. And I think that's why we want to integrate controlled vocabularies, because I think if you teach the tool that a controlled vocabulary is the thing it needs to refer to, it's going to get better at predicting if you tell it this is the standard you need to use it against. And to be fair, I don't know that the Archive 360 team isn't using it. I just don't know which language it is or which model it is, because it's not really something that people in a private sector will share with the public sector, right? That's just a common thing. But I can tell from the keywords that they're not indexed because I have multiple versions of the same word that come up. So we're doing our own corrective indexing and comparing that to our integrated controlled vocabulary. And then there's obviously the question of which controlled vocabulary is the right one, Where is it coming from? Where is that data being generated from? Who's telling you that it's the right one? And how do we adjust for the changes that we want to apply for our own collection? Great question, thank you.
Can I maybe ask just a question to end here? I'm just really curious about like to hear your thoughts on the materiality of the collection. You know, like what happens to the objects once they're digitized? And it's kind of on my mind because when you were showing the tags and you said something to the effect of, like, we take out the tag photograph because we know it's a photograph, except that it's not actually, it's a photograph of a photograph. So there's a kind of like reversing there. We know that photographs are always partial. And so I'm kind of like wondering, is there anything in the materiality of the prints themselves that this wonderful system fails to capture? And you know, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on it as an expert in this area.
I think if we think about Laura's talk yesterday, I mean, when you're dealing with mass digitization, you're always kind of making you are making a few concessions, right? You're not adjusting, like I mentioned, you're not adjusting the lens for every object. You're trying to get kind of an even consistency so that you can access and read the object. You can tell it's a photograph. Because we are using that standard, we're trying to preserve the objectness as much as possible. And our public presentation of it, which is this portal, cites that it's a photograph and that it's a materiality. So I guess that's my assumption. So thank you for pointing it out, because it's a helpful perspective to understand. I don't know that we have, I think it's worth analyzing that question, like, are we missing information? We spent a lot of time trying to meet a standard to replicate what we do with press photography already as digital objects. I don't think by any means we're in a position to say, like, throw it out. You know, like, we will keep this object and we will keep access to it and provide access to it. I think from our perspective, digitizing it preserves it in its current condition, and then we can take more care with the object and provide access this way as instead of the original. And then we go to the original when we absolutely have to. So we still want to make it accessible. We still want the original object to be available. It's just that it's accessed less frequently than it is now, and which in theory preserves it longer. So it's kind of a double-edged sword.
That's a great answer. Thank you. All right, we have time for one more question. I think there was one. Paul's pointing over here. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Unfortunately, I missed yesterday, so the question I'm going to ask may have been answered yesterday. But
Yeah, that's okay.
I was recently working with a collection where there were two images of the same person. I could see this. One was labeled or given the caption of the person's name, and the other was an unidentified woman. In terms of visual recognition, would AI pick that up and be able to provide the information accurately?
So from my understanding, right now, the image recognition software can only really recognize images of the data set that it's given. So for example, if it's a celebrity, probably. But you'd have to then give it back its own data to retrain it, if that makes sense. So if the image recognition software says, oh, this is, you know, this is Massey, you could in theory retrain it and say, okay, remember, this is Massey. You already found this out again. So look for derivatives of that person. Trying to find where that image, or this person, actually, this is a better example, right? It's like, okay, remember, you saw this on a verso, that this was this person. Remember, that's that person in the future. But I don't think it happens simultaneously. In this protocol, it did not happen simultaneously. It was only really recognized.
Identify the discrepancy and
Correct.
give it the data set that will allow it to go back. Okay.
Yeah, unless there was a good index that already existed of that image recognition. For the experts out there, is that a yes to the people who are developing data sets? Anybody? That's what it wasn't simultaneous for us. So there's a lot of there's retooling and retraining that has to be done, and that's why I think for us duplicates are really interesting and important, and variations on those things are duplicates are interesting. So we're very much hoping that that can be broadened and that the language model can be retooled for that purpose.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Please congratulations.